everybody. Hey, I'm Karen Hartglass. You are listening today to It's All About Food, now in its 10th year. We've been doing this show for over 10 years, and I think that's something to celebrate. I'm always looking for things to celebrate every day. Somebody mentioned something on Facebook on one of my recent posts saying, "You're always celebrating." Well, it's good to look for things to celebrate and things to be grateful for, because it's kind of a scary, troubled planet, troubled world that we live on. We do the best we can, and we have to really be mindful and look for the good, because I think that we can be more productive when we take time to nurture ourselves and take care of ourselves. So this show today is, for me, I'm doing this for you, obviously, but I'm doing it for me too, because I'm bringing on a guest that I love speaking with, and I love reading her books. So let's do that right now, and I'll tell you more about it. We have Robin Lamont, who has just completed a new book called The Experiment. And Robin, as you may know, has worked on Broadway, and she played lead roles in Godspell Grease and Working. And her original cast recording of Day by Day and her film version of the song have drawn fans from around the world. Utilizing her acting experience, she became an undercover investigator in New York City, and that specialized in investigations into counterfeiting. And during that time, she went to law school and later practiced as an assistant district attorney in New York. More recently, while continuing her writing, Robin volunteers for animal welfare organizations trying to raise awareness about the plight of animals throughout the world. Robin, how are you today?
I'm very well. I'm exhausted listening to that description of my life.
You know, I want to talk about your life because I love Renaissance people, especially Renaissance women, and you are definitely one of them. And I'm wondering, so we're not even jumping right into the topic, we're just talking about you. But were you born with anything special, like a belief that you could do anything? What empowered you to be able to take on different careers?
Gee, I'm not sure. I came from a very large family in Brooklyn, and, you know, I always wanted to write. And, you know, one of my first experiences was I wanted to be a journalist. So I think at the age of 9 or 10, since the New York Times wasn't hiring at that age, I decided to do a family newspaper. So I would gather stories about the babysitter's boyfriend and fights within my siblings. After a few weeks, I got very tired of that. And from our house in Brooklyn Heights, you could look over the promenade and see what was happening at the Brooklyn Navy Yards. So I thought, wow, there must be some really good stories down there. So one day after school, you know, in my little skirt and knee socks and loafers, I traipsed on down to the Brooklyn Navy Yard to interview some of the dock workers, just never thinking that this was not an appropriate thing for a 10 or 11-year-old girl to do. And I got some good stuff, but when my parents read that next issue of the family newspaper, they said, "You went where?" So I don't know. I think there was always just this sense of adventure for me. And
if you had done that today, in today's time, a young child interviewing people down at the Brooklyn Yard like that, it would go viral.
It would. Yeah, it might.
I mean, I could see a little video on YouTube and everybody sharing it. Yeah.
It would have been fun.
Oh, well. Maybe you could write a story about that.
Yeah, maybe.
Anyway, I think it's really a good thing or beneficial for people to acknowledge that it takes hard work, but if we want something, we can go for it. And you've jumped from one thing to another, success here, success there, and now you're writing these wonderful books that I love. And I was saying that I'm doing this show for me because when I have authors on the show, I read their book from start to finish. And some of them are nutrition-related, doctor books, things about food, of course, all the time. Some of them are about economics, some of them about the climate change and the environment. Some of them are heavy in science. Sometimes they're animal-related, and people tell wonderful animal stories. But your books are fiction.
Yeah, yeah.
And we're going to touch on some of the subjects that you have thread into your story or woven into your story so well. But I think I don't want to use the word clever, but it's wonderful how you bring so many of these important issues into a fictional story where it's exciting to read, but it's not scary.
Huh.
And it's like it's just more approachable, I think.
For me, that's the whole point. As an animal advocate, for many years, I began to see what was happening to animals across the globe in terms of industrialized animal abuse. And what I mean by that is, large corporations that they don't mean to hurt animals, but in the production of food or pharmaceuticals or fur or whatever, they're killing massive numbers of animals. And that really got to me, and it still gets to me.
Why doesn't it get to everybody?
Yes, and so I found very early on, even just in talking with members of my own family, that they didn't want to look at horrible videos of animals being slaughtered, or they didn't want to see anything or hear anything graphic or horrible. And I understand that. There's a lot of videos on Facebook now that I just go, I've seen that. I really don't want to look at that again. So where was it? Yeah, I really felt like I wanted to bring an understanding or an awareness of what was happening, but do it in a way that people wouldn't reject it outright. And for me, stories are a remarkable way to do that.
And there are plenty of images in this story that are scary.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to say that it's not scary, but it's just more palatable because it's fiction. And I think for people that are not that familiar with what's going on, it's really a great way to open the door to this horrible reality that we're all living in.
Yes.
And, you talk about the videos. You're probably familiar with one of the most recent videos that have come out with Fair Oaks Farm, the dairy farm, that they tell you how wonderful they're treating their cows and their veal calves, and that they don't send the veal calves to slaughter. And this undercover video has shown what a giant, massive, horrific lie it all is. And I wasn't able to look at the video. And
I saw a piece, yeah.
I can't see it because as soon as I open my heart to that, I hear screams, I feel pain, and I'm Anyway.
Yeah. Well, in this recent book, The Experiment, I chose my subject in part because I knew that, I know that people love their dogs. And I'm not trying to equate, loving your dog with loving a pig or not eating meat necessarily. But I wanted to show what is happening and still happening that many people don't know about in terms of testing on canines.
Right.
And
so let's go back. Your first book, The Chain, was about, that was the first one, wasn't it? The Chain?
Yes, it was. Yeah, and this series, yeah.
Yeah, and that introduced us to factory farming and what pigs go through, and it was another exciting thriller. with your main character, Jude, the private investigator.
Yes.
And then she went on to do another exciting undercover story that had to do with wolves and traps.
That's right.
Right?
Yep. Yes. I took a look at what's happening primarily out west, but it's all over the U.S. in terms of what Wildlife Services, which is a branch of the USDA, what they're doing, how many animals they kill by trapping for basically the meat industry.
And we learn in this story how some of the government actions are not based on any truth or reality, and they're it's just a big problem. And we learn a lot in the book through a fictional story about what's really going on. And now you have the experiment. Before we go into the story, and there will be no sharing of what actually goes on in this story because I want people to read it. And I have to say that I read it in a few hours. I just started and just I couldn't put it down. I also had to read it quickly, but but the good thing was I wanted to know, okay, what happens next? The first thing I want to know, you acknowledge a bunch of people in the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know what kind of research you did to put this together and who helped you and what specifically they helped you with.
Well, a lot of people did. I knew from the outset that I wanted to take a look at animal testing, but I'm not a scientist and I was not very familiar with the ins and outs. So I talked extensively with Michael Budke, who used to work in an animal testing lab. And found he couldn't deal with it as a young man. It tortured him. So he began an organization called SANE, which is Stop Animal Exploitation Now. And he does really amazing work through the Freedom of Information Act, getting documents and the real facts behind what is happening to animals in the labs. And it's not merely about the fact that they're being tested on, but that they're not treated particularly well in the laboratories. So
that brings up a question of whether we should be using animals for testing. I know how I feel about it. Mm-hmm. And is there a way to use animals for testing where they're not harmed? It's a very complicated subject, and I know that it gets really to the heart of people's individual sense of fear. That sense of, oh my God, if it was my child, I'd want them to test on animals to cure my child. That's the first thing I always hear. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I get that. I understand that. However, animal testing at this point is really carrying on by inertia only. There are so many new models, computer models, cellular models, computer modeling that can take the place of animals in being tested on in the laboratory. So there's new replacements for this, but I think also that most people aren't aware of that animal testing is not particularly efficient. I was looking into pesticides in particular for this book, and according to PCRM, for every pesticide brought to market, approximately 13,000 animals die. Wow. In the testing. And there are now over 10,000 pesticides on the market. Mm-hmm. It's mostly mice, right? It's primarily rodents, yes. However, that doesn't make it better. No, it doesn't, just because
people have an aversion to rodents doesn't mean they don't suffer. And, for me, the animal testing is mostly about our hubris as human beings, feeling that animals are a tool that we use to make our lives a little better, I guess.
Or that they're here for us to do with what we want.
We will. Exactly.
I think that's an unfortunate thing, but it's definitely what humans are all about, this hierarchy that we have. And a lot of people are surprised with what's going on with our government, not just in the United States, but around the world. There's a lot of turmoil going around, and some people think that it's worse than it's ever been. And although I'm not at all happy with our current federal government, and I say that with a smile, I'm gritting my teeth, I think that a lot of us, animal rights activists, a lot of minority populations have seen tremendous cruelty and abuse with themselves or with people around them, and have seen this gone on for decades. So hearing about what's going on with animals, it's been going on, and with people in our government now, it's not a surprise. Humans treat other humans horribly, and they treat animals even worse.
Yes. Well, it's interesting you should bring that up, because I was going to write a letter to the New York Times about an article the other day that came out about this Clint, Texas detention facility for young migrants. And they interviewed one of the Border Patrol agents who said, basically he hated what he was doing. He said, but you get to be like a robot. Mm. And I read that, and I was so reminded of the research that I had done for the chain, because you'll hear slaughterhouse workers say the same thing. In order to stun and kill that many animals in assembly line fashion, they have to turn off their feelings. And those feelings don't magically get switched on at the end of the day, which is why there are usually very high rates of domestic violence, alcohol, and drug abuse in slaughterhouse towns. And it made me think that, it's very easy to dehumanize even people, to dehumanize young immigrants. And we're even now dehumanizing the workers that have to deal with them every day. They feel terrible, so they just turn off their feelings. Mm-hmm. And this is what we've been doing about animals for a long, long time. So I think it's possible, once you turn off your feelings to animals, that maybe it's possible to turn them off to humans as well.
Oh, absolutely. There's plenty of evidence that shows that people that do harm to animals will do harm to humans.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, so Michael Budke is fantastic. I love his work with SANE. Any others?
I talked to Alka Chenna.
We love her.
Yes, we love her. Dr. Aisha Akhtar, who is just amazing.
And what did they help you with?
Well, they help put a lot of the issues into perspective, and to give me some insight into who I might talk to further about some of the very specific issues that I had with in the experiment. Okay,
and the last one that I wanted to hear more about was Michael Hansen of Consumers Union.
Yes. Well, I had some very specific questions about the genetic modification of plants that is also part of the story in the experiment. Because this was not an area about which I knew very much. I read as much as I could, but sometimes the scientific language was just way over my head. So, usually in that situation I want to call up an expert and just say, look, if this happens, is this possible?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
he was very helpful in that regard.
So you linked a lot of different things in the story. As you mentioned, genetically modified foods. You've got a genetically modified corn product in this story used for pharmaceuticals, plant manufacturing pharmaceuticals. And that's another subject. Because genetically modified organisms is one thing, but then specifically growing drugs in plants is another.
Yes.
And then you also include drug addiction and drug abuse in this story. What else? And then, of course, animal experimentation. I want to say that there were some overtones about people with extreme privilege and what that will cause them to do.
Yes.
And although this show is called It's All About Food, I often say it's also all about money.
Yes, indeed.
And it was genius and very enjoyable how you linked all of these very problematic things. Also, pesticide use.
Well, yeah, thanks. I mean...
And organic food contamination.
Organic food contamination, absolutely. Well, to me, it's sort of what brought about the title of the book is not only are animals being experimented on, but genetically modified foods, genetically modified plants to grow drugs. It's all a big experiment on nature and on human beings.
And although this is a fictional story, it's an excellent example about how things can go wrong, especially when it comes to genetically modified plants that are out in the open and not controlled. There are a certain amount of rules and regulations. They're a little flimsy about the borders that are required around a farm that's growing an experimental plant.
Yeah, yeah.
But nature is so much smarter, and pollen can just go off and go wherever it wants and cross-contaminate very easily, especially organic plants. And we see this today. And I've talked to, what's his name? The author of Eating Tomorrow, Tim Wise. There you go. He talked at length, or he put in his book at length about corn in Mexico and varieties where they're starting to see little bits of contamination, and they want to shut down all the genetic modified varieties. There aren't any, but there have been plots of testing going on, and the contamination would be just a disaster. I mean, there are so many different heirloom varieties of rice and corn and so many different things, and we just don't know what it's going to do.
No, we don't. We don't. And it also gets back to what you were talking about before in terms of the government. Now, the USDA does have rules about how you can grow genetically modified organisms and the borders that you need and the buffer zones, etc. But the vast majority of this stuff is being grown by private farmers. The biggest farm growing transgenic corn right now, along with food corn, is in Iowa, and it's a family farm growing the transgenic corn for a French therapeutics biologics company.
So this is a plant that manufactures a drug?
Yes,
wow.
Yes. So it's sort of like, self-regulation in the slaughterhouses. If the USDA takes out all the federal inspectors and says, well, it's too expensive, which is what this administration wants to do, we'll just let them
regulate. Ha ha
self-regulate. Ha ha ha. And
I'm crying.
Corporations have no incentive to self-regulate. They have no incentive to do anything that will cost them more money. So sometimes they will just let stuff happen and be willing to pay the price.
Now, in your story, I don't want to give anything away, but I mentioned that there are corn plants growing that have a drug in them, and people accidentally eat them, and it's not meant for them to be eaten. But this is not unusual. This is not unusual. As I mentioned in that book, I think it was Eating Tomorrow, which I just mentioned, by Tim Wise, or maybe it was an article he wrote, I don't remember. But he talked about how corn, genetically modified corn, would come into the country. They didn't grow it, but they were allowed to bring it in for different reasons. And curious farmers, just curious, grew some. Wow. They didn't know what they were growing, and that ended up contaminating other things. So you can have people growing things by accident. You could have people consuming things by accident, all very innocent.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And in your story, it turns out to be almost fatal.
Yes, what propelled this idea was I had read early in my research about an incident that happened about a dozen years ago. There was a company called Protogene that decided to grow a pig vaccine in corn. And they were semi-successful, using a private farmer to do it. So they raised all the corn, took it down, and decided to burn it, which they did. Well, the farmer then planted soybeans in the same soil. And when they were ready for market, he started to ship it to market where it was going to be for human consumption. Mm. Somehow that shipment got stopped and inspected, and they found the pig vaccine in the soybeans. Wow. They were able to stop that particular shipment, but it made me think, wow, it could get really hairy out there.
It may have already have happened.
It may have. We don't know.
We don't know. There's so many things that go on that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are sick.
Yep.
And the symptoms can be short-term or they could be long-term. And it's really difficult for medical practitioners to diagnose anything anymore.
Absolutely.
You come in with stomach problems, fatigue, aches and pains. What do you got? It can be like a million things.
Right. Yeah, it could be. And it may easily be food that they've eaten.
Yeah. Now, did you interview or look into what it's like, other than your own experience as a private investigator, know what it's like to go undercover like that in a laboratory or as before in your other books?
Well, I spoke, of course, with Michael Budke, but he wasn't undercover. I had spoken to a few undercover investigators in different areas, in factory farms and slaughterhouses. So this one, I just used my imagination, but I also used my own experience and about what it's generally like to be undercover, and how tricky that is, and how one has to, it's like juggling a lot of balls in the air at the same time. You have to maintain your persona. You're also, at the same time, trying to ferret out and draw out information that maybe some people don't want to give you. You're constantly gauging the level of suspicion that you're drawing. It's a very complicated, often scary proposition.
Well, I'm very grateful for many people who have done these undercover investigations in factory farms and in laboratories, and they have risked a lot. And those who work in this environment in order to get good footage, I can't imagine doing it, because the people that go to do it, they already are animal activists. They don't want this to happen, and yet they have to go along in order to find the proof to share in order to make it stop. Somehow the ends justify the means.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't want to make a judgment here, but it takes a very special kind of person to do that, and maybe not the most stable person.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, so that makes it even harder, because to be able to go into this situation and do that work and be careful undercover, I just can't imagine. Imagine. And so your character, Tim, who goes undercover, we don't know much about him because he's gone most of the story.
Yes.
We hear about him through so many other people. But you wonder, at least I wondered, like, what happened? Because so many things could happen in this sort of situation to someone who's sensitive to what's going on.
Yes, absolutely.
And we'll never know, will we?
Well, we will if we read the book.
Yes.
But yes.
I want to know more about Tim, and I want to know more about Jude. All right. So tell me more about the Kinship series. I remember you telling me you were going to write this one. Are there more stories?
I think there are more stories. There's no starting another book for the present. I am working on trying to create a possible TV series based on the whole concept of investigators who work for animal protection.
Right. That's awesome. I was thinking of a movie, but I think a series would be even better.
I think it could handle a series. I really do. So I'm working on that and trying to see if I can put what they call a treatment together, and I think it could be very, very interesting.
Absolutely. Get James Cameron behind you.
That would be wonderful. If anyone has his number or his email address.
I'll work on that.
Yeah,
we definitely need that, because fictional stories are the only way that you'll be able to show them to a mainstream audience.
Absolutely.
Because nobody's going to let you show undercover videos, because they're already slapping laws in different states. Some of them have been shot down, but many places were not allowed to go in and take film to some of these places because of what's going on.
Yes.
Oh, I like that idea. Okay. So I was going to say, what's your next career? But maybe next is a screenwriter or something like that.
It could be. It could be.
Okay. Do you want to talk anything else about the experiment? I have some other things to talk about with you.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I guess what I wanted also, going back to this idea of animals as tools, as sort of things for us to use, I did learn, and I didn't write about it this time, but that plants are not the only organisms that are being tested in terms of creating drugs and enzymes and vaccines. There's now use of animals that are genetically modified to produce milk that contains large quantities of enzymes to treat certain diseases. So, the rationale in many of the medical journals behind this is, well, just like plants, they're easy to grow, and then when you're done with them, you just get rid of them, and it's the upkeep is not as bad as trying to grow drugs in cellular cultures in a laboratory.
Now that's just crazy.
Yeah, isn't that just crazy?
That's just crazy, because we're starting to talk about growing meat in a laboratory.
Yes.
And how that will be easier, ultimately, than raising animals for food. So this is going in the other direction.
It is going in the other direction.
People don't really know what they're talking about.
That's another topic.
But it's all about money. It's like whoever can come up with a clever idea.
Yeah.
And where most of the answers are right in front of our nose.
Yeah.
So if everyone would eat a whole food, healthy plant diet, we'd have like next to no heart disease, next to no diabetes. We'd have much smaller percentage of cancer. And medical scientists could really focus on the things that we know nothing about to solve them.
Absolutely. And it may well be that every time we create something scientifically, all the processed food, and that it's making people sick. Mm-hmm. So
exactly. I'm also concerned about using plants to manufacture drugs.
Yeah.
Because right now we have plants, corn in particular, and they're being used for biofuels.
Yes.
And this has caused an imbalance in the pricing of corn for food for people, corn for food to make animal feed, to feed animals to feed people.
Yep.
And so the prices are all out of whack, and there's only so many acres available for growing things. That do we really want to be using corn for biofuels, which are also contributing to climate change? Okay, maybe it's in the short term good that we're not relying on countries that we don't like to deal with very much and getting oil from them. But still, it's not a good solution. So if we started having to grow plants for medicines, that was starting to encroach the plants growing for food. There's only so much land mass on this planet.
There is. And with the use of pesticides and things like glyphosate, we are reducing the available land for growing food.
I wasn't thinking really very much about plants manufacturing pharmaceuticals until I read your book, and it's just a new thing to worry about.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Very happy to contribute.
I don't need it, yeah, but it's true.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. My question is sort of in the line of using animals, especially dogs. Well, not especially, all animals that are used in experimentation. It's wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I don't think the benefits are worth what we do to all of these animals. And just to say that so many experiments go on that fail.
Yes, absolutely.
That may be positive in the animal that is being tested on, but are not positive in humans.
No. And, there are just so many reasons. The doses of, first of all, canines, dogs, are the number one non-rodent species for testing toxicity in pesticides, which is really sad. Because, and beagles in particular.
Yeah, because they're so nice, right?
They're so nice.
And trusting.
They're easy to handle. Their size makes them easy to handle. Their disposition makes them very sweet dogs. And scientists have a lot of knowledge on their physiology. But it's just unfathomably cruel to raise puppies in another laboratory for the very purpose of testing on them. And most of the dogs that go to testing laboratories are about 5-6 months old. They're babies.
And then when the test is done, they're euthanized.
Most of them are euthanized. There are some wonderful organizations out there now, like Beagle Freedom Project and others, who are working really hard to make deals with some of these laboratories to release at least the control dogs.
The ones who haven't been given the poison.
Who haven't been given the poison, to release them for adoption. So they're working very hard to do that, but it's, the laboratories don't really care, I don't think, and it's probably easier to euthanize them along with the animals that have become sick.
You posted on Facebook a story that I wanted to mention about some dolphins that saved a dog that fell into a canal and could have drowned, and the dog was out in the water for some 15 hours or something. This was a powerful story.
Yeah.
And teaches us, if we don't know already, how smart these non-human animals are. Dolphins and dogs. Yes.
I'm always drawn to that kind of story because, yes, it's amazing, and we are beginning to understand that animals have compassion. And obviously those dolphins felt for this struggling dog that was drowning in the canal and kept the dog alive until help could come.
It's amazing. And the photo, whoever took it, showed the dog sitting on one of the dolphins.
Yes.
I mean, it was just lovely.
I know.
And the dolphins were smart enough to communicate to the humans to help their dog by making noise. And it was just amazing story. And we need more stories like that. Real stories, but also fiction stories. Because we respond more to those individual stories.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
You know, I don't know how many dogs are killed in animal testing. Do you have any idea?
I don't know. It's in the thousands every year.
So when we talk about numbers, it's like being numb. We're numb to numbers. We're numb to numbers. But when we hear an individual story,
yes,
that's what makes us respond and react.
Yeah. And in the experiment, I mean, for your listeners, you know, I don't want to give away the ending, but there is a particular dog in there that gets out, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good part of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I really recommend people reading The Experiment. It's, like I said, I couldn't put it down. And I'm actually thinking of going back and reading your other stories to kind of see the development of Jude and some of the other characters that I mentioned that were mentioned in this story, and I didn't exactly remember the details about them. So it could be fun to go back and reread them.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I did want to do in this book was to really dive into her character a little bit more than I had in the past, and really try to figure out, well, I wanted to be able to portray for mainstream readers what an animal protection investigator is and does, because a lot of people don't even know. Mm-hmm. I mean, for those of us who are animal advocates, we know what an animal investigator does, but many people don't understand that. And sorry.
Go ahead.
I wanted to dive more into her character, to create someone that would resonate with readers even if they didn't understand what she did for a living.
One other thread that was woven into this story was feminism.
Yeah.
Because this is a woman, a strong character, who is doing things that some men don't want to see women doing.
Yeah. And she does things, I think, that drive her to the fringes of society. And what effect does that have on her? So it's all part of the book.
All part of the book. Cool. Well, I'm very excited, and I really, really want to see this become a television series. I'm not a big TV watcher, but I would watch your series.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Yes, I could really see it. I'm starting to cast it in my head now.
Yeah.
Who would play Jude?
A lot of good people.
Yeah, there are. And maybe you could get a vegan actor to play her.
why not?
Exactly.
Why not?
Yeah. Okay, so we just have a few more minutes, and I want to just talk about real life in the area that we live in, the New York metro area. You're in Connecticut now?
Yes, right.
So what have you been eating that you've been enjoying lately?
Well, we're getting some nice fresh produce. And next year, I'm going to be starting my own vegetable garden. It was too difficult this year with getting the book out and everything, but next year's is the garden.
Very important. Maybe you'll include a garden in your next story.
Yes, and I am watching the apple trees and the one peach tree that I planted last season getting a little bigger. We won't get apples this year, but maybe in a couple years.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's exciting.
It's hard being a farmer. And I get very protective. I go in and go, why is this leaf yellow? What's happening? You know, I don't want to spray them, but should I be spraying them? So I'm learning as I go. But it's not easy being a farmer.
Yep, and that's a whole nother subject that can take up a lot of time. But I'm looking forward to when our government finally gets around to breaking up monopolies and big corporations get smaller into littler companies and giant agribusinesses get smaller, and because bigger is not better. And we go back to farming more varied plots of land, no monocropping, and growing food locally around more urban areas rather than growing big swaths of monocropped things.
Absolutely.
That only cause disaster. But part of it is seeing that yellow leaf and paying attention. Having a little more knowledge, of course, is useful.
Yes.
But we cannot rely on automation to take care of our food supply.
Yes. No, and you know, it reminds me that why, you know, individual plots and farmers who know what they're doing locally can plant vegetables and fruits that will sustain drought where we have drought, that will sustain more water when there's more water. It's, you know, you can't just grow anything anywhere. And, you know, I look at that and I go, well, you know, some people, some big corporation may say, oh, a yellow leaf, let's spray it with pesticide because that's the easiest and cheapest thing.
Exactly.
They want every single apple that tree will produce, and sometimes you don't get that if you leave them alone.
Now, where you're living, are there any vegan restaurants that you have visited recently that are worth mentioning?
Unfortunately, there are no vegan restaurants. There's a Thai place or Vietnamese place about 20 minutes from here that we love called Sprouts. And it's in Bethel, Connecticut. And it's wonderful food, very friendly. And, yeah, I mean, they make chicken and beef, but they do great things with tofu and vegetables, and that's our go-to place.
Wonderful. Well, Robin,
I cook a lot.
That's good. That's important. Everyone should cook a lot.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, Robin, thank you. Thank you for sending me your book and letting me read it and coming on the show and talk about it. It's been fun.
Well, thank you, and congratulations on your 10-year anniversary.
Thank you. I'm going to keep blabbling on and on, maybe for another 10.
I hope so. I really hope so.
Thank you for joining me. That's Robin Lamont, the author of the new book, The Experiment. Thank you. Okay, we just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to talk about a few things. I finally got to the New York City restaurant in Brooklyn called Modern Love. Now, some of you may be familiar with it. Isa Chandra Moskowitz started Modern Love in Nebraska, and then she brought her restaurant to Brooklyn. And I finally got there with Gary. we were celebrating our 13th anniversary on July 4th. Now, other people celebrate other things on July 4th. We weren't really celebrating any American holidays. We were celebrating our own holiday. And I wanted to just briefly mention our experience there because I think it's definitely worth a visit if you're looking for some really wonderful comfort food. So Gary ordered the special, and it was kind of like a barbecue kind of plate. It was a barbecue of sorts. It had a barbecued tofu, but the exciting feature on it were fried green tomatoes, and I haven't really seen them anywhere. So this was kind of a fun, different thing, and it's inspired me to look into making a version that's more my style, and I'll get into what that is in a minute. But they were fried green tomatoes, and they were thick and juicy, and they had so much flavor to them. It was just a really fun thing to bite into. But I'm thinking, you know me, I'm into more of a healthy, no oil, no fried thing, except when we're going out and doing something special. It's out of the ordinary. But I'm thinking I could do a baked version of this with my gluten-free seed breading. And I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to try this breading, but I make it with ground pumpkin seeds and spices. I've used it so far on onions to make onion rings, and it's a really fun recipe. I've used it on zucchini to make a fried zucchini, and that's actually coming out in a new cookbook later this year that Gary and I are a part of. And I've used it on a number of different things that are used for breading. And it's great because if you want to avoid not only frying food, but gluten in your breading, this is a great breading to try. So that's on my list to try sometime soon. The question is finding the right green tomatoes to make that happen. Yeah. And let's see, where else? We've been jumping around trying in a number of different places, a number of different foods that are fun. And I've gotten some nice comments and tips from people on this show. So I would invite you again, if there's something on the show that has triggered something you want to talk about, please reach out. I'm at info@realmeals.org, and we would love to hear from you. Just a few minutes left. I wanted to briefly touch on the subject of almonds. Do we have enough time for this? So you may have heard that almonds take up a lot of bees, and you're probably well aware of the colony collapse disorder going on, where we're losing bees and the colonies of bees are going down. And apparently California almonds use more bees than anywhere. And I was reading an article recently talking about how a lot of the almond farmers were really frightened because they didn't know where they were going to be getting their bees from. And it's crazy now because we're moving bees around all over the country and sometimes from outside of the country just to have enough pollinating bees for a particular time when a tree or a plant needs pollinating. And it's a crisis. And we need a lot of pollinators around. But my concern is this one particular article I was reading was talking about the reasons for the colony collapse disorder, and one of them is this varroa mite. Other things, of course, are the horrible pesticides that the bees get to consume, and it kills them. But I'm not seeing the solutions that I want to see because people are looking at what kind of chemicals or pesticides can kill the varroa mites. What we need, like I mentioned before, is balance. We need smaller farms where wildflowers and beneficial insects and beneficial plants can be grown in the same environment as the fruit-producing or nut-producing or vegetable-producing plant or tree is growing. And there are numerous organic methods for getting the varroa mites. For example, I was reading one farmer uses powdered sugar. It's kind of labor-intensive, but it works for beekeepers in a small environment. And that's the key, where bigger is not necessarily better at all. Bigger is not better. And how do we get to this point where we can make changes? We have to do this individually. All of us have to play a part. And I can't recommend enough, if you're not growing food or gardening. I'm not. I just have a terrace. I dream of it because I think it's in all of our nature to create our own food. There's something really fun about seeing food growing. At least I know for me it is. If we can't grow our own food, then we need to fight for those who can and educate our politicians. They need a lot of education. I know I've got a few letters to write right now, and I hope you are doing the same. And if you need any, what do I want to say? If you have any ideas or a passion about something particular and you want more people teaming up with you to create something, I hope that you would reach out to me. I will share it to my list, but we need to do more. The job isn't over, and it's getting scarier. But I want to leave you on a happy note. So there's a lot of things to be grateful for, and one of them is this book, The Experiment by Robin Lamont. I found it really, really inspiring. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Karen Hartglass, and next week we'll be talking with Karen Davis, who has a new book out called For the Birds. Have a delicious week.